that feeling you get, right? That kind of unease with how power works, the hierarchies, the feeling that things could be, well, different.
Mm.
Today, we're diving straight into that. One of you asked about understanding the roots of it all, the domination, the control, and finding a way to wake the sleepers from that nightmare.
That's a big one. It really gets to the heart of the human experience, doesn't it? This tension,
Yeah.
wanting autonomy, but being caught in these systems.
Exactly. Where does it start?
Yeah.
So to explore this, we're looking at a pivotal story, but with a really surprising lens. We've got the biblical account, 1 Samuel 8, Israel asking for a human king.
Right, the classic story.
But we're not just reading it straight, we're bringing in the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, to really dig deeper.
And what's so fascinating, I think, is how the Zohar takes this event, which looks political on the surface, a nation wanting a ruler, and just reveals these hidden spiritual dynamics.
Totally.
It makes you really reconsider how even our societal structures have these profound, often unseen spiritual roots.
It really does. The Zohar gives us this framework, maybe, to see how that ancient desire for a king, well, how it still shapes how we think about power today. So our mission for this deep dive is to pull out the key insights from 1 Samuel 8 and the Zohar, to shed some light on where hierarchy fundamentally comes from, and maybe hint at, how things could shift.
Sounds good. Where do we start? That historical moment.
Yeah, let's unpack that turning point. So 1 Samuel chapter 8, the elders go to Samuel. What's the immediate trigger?
Well, the text says Samuel was getting older, and crucially, his sons, they weren't exactly following in his footsteps integrity-wise.
Right. Not good.
So the elders come and say, pretty directly actually, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations.
Like all the nations. That phrase really jumps out. It sounds like they just wanted to fit in, have a standard government.
That's definitely the surface reading. But you have to remember, their system before this was really different. It was essentially a theocracy.
God as the ultimate king, right,
Yeah.
working through prophets and judges.
Exactly. People believed to have that divine spark, that inspiration.
So asking for a human king wasn't just swapping leaders. It was a fundamental shift away from that direct divine authority.
A huge shift.
Yeah.
And God's reaction, it tells you a lot.
Yeah. Not exactly thrilled, was he?
No. He says to Samuel quite powerfully, "They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from reigning over them."
Oh, so God sees it as a rejection of his rule.
Directly. Which underscores, the massive spiritual dimension of this request.
Yeah.
It wasn't just practical politics. It was turning away from something fundamental.
And Samuel, acting on God's instructions, he warns them, doesn't he? He gives them a pretty bleak picture of kingship.
Oh, yeah. No rosy picture at all. Samuel lays out some harsh realities. He says the king will take their sons for his army, their daughters for his household.
Take their stuff, basically.
Right. Take the best of their fields, vineyards, olive groves, impose taxes, conscript labor. It paints a picture of exploitation, really.
Yeah.
A ruler serving himself.
And that final line is chilling. When that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you on that day.
It's incredibly sobering, a serious prediction of consequence.
So Samuel's disappointment wasn't just personal ego then?
No, our source material suggests he understood the motivation. They wanted a king for material problems. And crucially, to be like all the nations. The focus was external, worldly.
Not spiritual elevation.
Exactly, not their unique covenant or potential. And this is where the Zohar starts to add another layer. It talks about a darkness of separation from delight. What's that about?
Okay, delight. What does that mean here?
Think of the divine, the connection to God, as the ultimate source of, joy, fulfillment. That's the delight. Choosing a human king, especially for those material reasons, is seen as stepping away from that direct connection.
So it's a self-imposed separation.
Yes. And the darkness isn't just, bad things happening externally. It's an inner dimming, a loss of that spiritual light.
Okay, so Samuel's warnings. It sounds like more than just beware of tyrants. He's hinting at something systemic, structural, almost.
I think that's exactly right. When he talks about the king taking resources, conscripting people, seizing land, those are the mechanisms of structural oppression. It suggests that moving away from a divinely centered system inherently opens the door to human-centered power structures that can easily become unjust.
Right. The system itself becomes the issue, not just the individual leader.
Potentially, yes. That's the risk.
Okay, powerful stuff. So we have this moment. Now, let's really bring in the Zohar. You mentioned Melchett. For someone new to Kabbalah, what is Melchett?
Right, Melchut. It translates generally as kingdom or sovereignty. It's the 10th Sephira. Now, the Sephiro, think of them as 10 aspects or emanations of divine energy.
Like facets of God's light.
Kind of, yeah. And Malchut is the final one, the one closest to our realities, where that divine light becomes most, let's say, tangible, most manifest.
So it's the divine touching our world.
In a sense, yes. And it's often described in, well, quite specific terms. It's seen as the female principle, an archetypal recipient, meaning it doesn't generate its own light.
Yeah.
It receives light from the higher Sephiro, like the moon reflects the sun. But this receiving role is crucial. It's the final revelation of the divine light. It's even called the world of speech, how divine authority gets expressed here.
Huh. That's really different from how we usually think of kingship, which is often about projecting power, not receiving it.
Exactly. It's almost the opposite. And that's key to the Zohar's view of true kingship.
So what is true kingship, according to the Zohar?
It's not about grabbing power or self-assertion. It's about being a perfect vessel, a clear channel for that divine light. The ideal Jewish king, in this view, is the earthly embodiment of Malchut.
A living example.
A living example, exactly. Someone totally committed to God, whose purpose is to guide the whole nation towards its greatest spiritual heights. Less about ruling over, more about leading towards God.
So the focus is spiritual guidance, much more than, say, military strength or political maneuvering.
That's the ideal, yes.
Yeah.
Elevating the people spiritually. And this connects to another really important concept. Kabbalat ol Malchut Shamayim.
Okay, sounds complex. Yoke of the kingdom of heaven. That word yoke can sound negative, right? Like a burden.
It can, definitely. But in Kabbalah, it's understood very differently. It means the complete, willing acceptance of God's ultimate authority, especially in fulfilling the commandments, the mitzvah.
Willing acceptance.
Yes. And crucially, this yoke isn't seen as oppressive. It's a pathway, a path to profound spiritual growth, even to experiencing the divine directly being face-to-face with the Creator, as some texts put it.
So it's about alignment, not oppression.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Consciously choosing to align yourself, your will, with the divine will.
Okay. So if we put the biblical request side by side with this Zoharic ideal of Malchut, the motivations look totally different, polar opposites almost.
They really are. The biblical request, motivated by wanting to be like all the nations, focus on external order, security, maybe even conformity.
Yeah.
The Zoharic ideal, rooted in divine will, aspiration for spiritual connection. The source of authority is completely different to human demand versus the flow of divine light.
And the purpose shifts from earthly administration to spiritual elevation.
Right. And the very nature of the power involved, it's inverted. Human kingship risks becoming about taking, controlling, asserting. Malchut is about receiving and then channeling, giving forth.
The spiritual implications, then, are huge. The request was a step away from direct divine guidance.
While the Zoharic ideal is about fully embracing it, and the potential outcomes Samuel warned about tyranny, separation, loss of that inner delight.
Contrasts sharply with the Zoharic goal of spiritual unity and connection.
Absolutely. So from the Zohar's perspective, the human request fundamentally misunderstood or maybe inverted true authority, the aspect meant to receive and channel tried to become self-asserting.
Why is that specific inversion such a big problem in Kabbalah?
Because it disrupts the flow. Think of it like blocking a channel. Malchut is designed to receive that divine energy, that light, and bring it into the world constructively. When it becomes self-focused, seeking its own power, its own light source, it creates a blockage, a disconnection from the source of true nourishment, true life, true joy.
The source material also connects the nefesh, which it calls the lowest level of the soul, to Malchut and accepting this yoke of heaven. What does that tell us about why the nation might have made this choice back then?
That's a really interesting connection.
Yeah.
It suggests that the nation's collective spiritual state, their primary level of consciousness at that moment, heavily influenced their choice of leadership. Meaning, if their collective awareness, their collective nefesh, was mainly focused on the physical world, on immediate, tangible problems and solutions.
Like security, order.
Exactly. Then they would naturally gravitate towards a leader who promised that. A king, like all the nations, who could provide worldly security. It reflects a preference for what Kabbalah calls the will to receive for oneself. A more basic, natural, even ego-driven impulse. Wanting things for yourself. It contrasts with the higher ideal, the will to receive in order to bestow or share, which aligns with Melchud's true purpose.
So it's like a developmental stage almost, focusing on getting versus giving.
You could see it that way, a focus on self-preservation and immediate gratification versus a more mature, outwardly focused, spiritually aligned perspective.
Okay, so the Zohar doesn't commentary directly on 1 Samuel 8 word for word, but its principles really shine a light on why this was such a crucial and maybe problematic request. Samuel was worried they wanted a king for the wrong reasons.
Exactly. Not for spiritual growth, but for material order and conformity.
Even though having a king isn't inherently forbidden.
Right. The Torah allows for it. But the ideal, from this spiritual perspective, is a leader who helps the nation reach its spiritual potential. Their request signaled, perhaps, a lowering of sights, prioritizing the material over the sacred.
And this brings us back to that core Zoharic idea about light and darkness. Can you remind us how that fit out here?
Yeah, the principle is pretty stark. Any disconnection from light produces darkness. And from that darkness, chaos and destruction can emerge. The Zohar uses examples like the Great Flood, linking it to a separation within the divine structure itself between different sephiros.
So Israel, choosing a human king, driven by these worldly desires,
Was seen as a form of this disconnection from light, a voluntary step away from the source. And that causes the darkness of separation we talked about earlier, that inner dimming.
The source also mentioned this inherent human drive, the will to receive for oneself. How does the Zohar connect that to the rise of hierarchy and control?
Well, the Zohar identifies this will to receive for oneself as, like, the basic operating system of human nature in its uncorrected state.
Our default setting.
Kind of. And when this drive isn't balanced or transformed corrected, in Kabbalistic terms, it often leads to the perception that the only way to get what you want, to satisfy those desires, is through power, through force, through controlling others.
So that's the root of hierarchy and domination, this uncorrected desire.
That's a key part of the Zohar's understanding, yes. It becomes the engine driving the need for power structures. And the whole purpose of tikkun correction, reformation in the Zohar, is aimed at transforming this very will, shifting it from self-centered receiving to receiving in order to give.
So, by choosing external control, the king, they were actually embedding that will to receive structure more deeply and moving further from internal divine connection.
That's the paradox. And the spiritual cost is significant. They traded that potential for direct divine relationship for a human intermediary. And like Samuel warned, when things got tough later, that immediate divine responsiveness, that sense of God being right there, it wouldn't be the same.
Our source also notes our moral choices are tied to our spiritual destiny. Big decisions have big ripples.
Profound ripples. And that desire, like all the nations, the Zohar sees that impulse itself as problematic, stemming from a collective ego.
How does a collective ego distort Melchut?
Because Melchut, ideally, is about selfless receptivity, channeling divine light. The collective ego, driven by that will to receive for oneself, by insecurity, by wanting external validation, it wants a king who reflects worldly power, status, conformity.
Someone who looks impressive to others.
Exactly. A figure of earthly authority, not necessarily spiritual depth. This fundamentally twists Melchut's true nature away from receiving divine will towards asserting collective ego.
It really sounds like the Zohar functions as a kind of corrective mechanism for this historical moment, and maybe for us now, trying to wake up something deeper.
I think that's a great way to put it. It aims to wake loftier aspirations, to instill that inner strength for righteousness that allows us to see beyond the allure of simple human-defined power.
Okay, let's bring this right back to the listener's question. Hierarchy, domination, control in our world. Samuel's warnings about exploitation. Boy, do we see echoes of that.
Oh, absolutely. The source uses terms like structural violence and oppression. Samuel's warnings feel timeless, don't they? Descriptions of what can happen when human rule gets detached from higher ethical or spiritual principles.
And the history of Israel's own kings later on kind of proved his point, sadly.
It definitely illustrated the dangers. And the Zohar, with its focus on morality being key to human existence and its complex understanding of good and evil, gives us a vocabulary, a framework for why disconnected power tends towards corruption.
You mentioned soul levels earlier. How does our collective state of consciousness factor in?
Right, the 5 levels. The Zohar suggests that the collective desire for a king, like all the nations, indicates a consciousness operating primarily at the nefesh level.
The most basic material level.
Yes, focused on physical survival, immediate needs, tangible solutions, without a strong connection to the higher levels like ruach, motion spirit, neshama, intellect understanding, chaya, life force connection, Yachida, unity,
then the collective stays focused on the basics.
and remains more susceptible to those uncorrected drives, like the will to receive for oneself, which fuels the desire for external control, for hierarchy based on power rather than purpose. It's like being stuck looking only at your feet, missing the stars.
The source also used that beautiful image, the garments of Malchut, a spiritual robe of authority. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor. These aren't literal clothes, obviously.
Yeah.
It represents a kind of pure, holy, spiritual aura or essence that conveys true, divine authority.
Like an inner quality.
Exactly. Think of figures like Esther and Mordecai in the Purim story. The texts sometimes describe them as being clothed in these garments. They inspired awe and commanded respect not just because of temporary power, but because of their perceived deep connection to the divine.
So true authority comes from spiritual alignment, not just position or force.
That's the Zohar point. It starkly contrasts with human hierarchies built on coercion, fear, or just circumstance.
And when that divine connection is missing, the Zohar talks about the power of evil. These klipot. Sounds ominous.
Klipot literally means husks or shells. They represent negative forces, blockages that obstruct the flow of divine light and energy. When human authority gets divorced from its divine source, from that ethical spiritual core, it becomes vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what?
To these negative influences, to corruption, selfishness, abuse of power. The klipot can kind of latch on. The historical ups and downs of Israel's kingship, with periods of idolatry and injustice, tragically illustrate this possibility.
So structural violence, oppression, from this view, it stems from that collective disconnection from light, from the will to receive running unchecked.
Yes. It suggests that true authority is fundamentally spiritual and selfless. When that's absent, the vacuum is filled by corrupt power structures, fueled by these uncorrected desires and susceptible to these negative blockages.
So the societal problems we grapple with hierarchies, injustice, the Zohar would see them as symptoms of a deeper collective issue, a consciousness perhaps stuck at that nephesh level.
Precisely. It's suggesting the root cause isn't just bad policies or bad individuals, though those exist. It's a fundamental misalignment at a collective soul level, preventing an ascent to higher awareness, and consequently, more just and equitable ways of organizing ourselves.
Which brings us full circle to the listener's hope. How do we wake the sleepers? The source says the Zohar's explicit purpose is rescue, enabling tikkun, that correction.
Yes, the Zohar presents itself not just as a text to be studied, but as an active tool for tikkun, for bringing every spirit out of exile. Exile meaning that state of separation, of disconnection.
Tikkun olam, repairing the world.
Exactly. It emphasizes our active role in correcting these imbalances, both personal and collective.
And a huge part of that seems to be about reconnecting, reestablishing that covenant, returning to the source of light. How does the Zohar say we do that?
Through actively engaging on the covenant. Through observance, yes, but also through deep study and understanding. This reconnects us. The Zohar explicitly links righteousness, ethical living, to bonding Malchut with Yesod, another Sephira representing foundation and connection, which is to banish darkness and restore light.
So neglecting the covenant, spiritually speaking, leads to that darkness of separation.
That's the connection it makes.
The source also highlighted cultivating reason in the place of authority and the Zohar's ethical focus. How does that push back against unfair hierarchies?
By fostering individuals who are morally grounded, who think critically, who can discern true leadership based on wisdom and ethics, not just power or status.
So it empowers people from within.
Exactly. To question unjust authority, not just out of rebellion, but from a place of inner clarity and spiritual strength.
So it's not just about changing external systems, but a deep internal transformation is needed first, or maybe simultaneously.
Absolutely. The Zohar points towards practical things like consciously working to overcome that self-centered will to receive for oneself, and living by core principles like love your neighbor as yourself.
Which, the source notes, the Zohar says requires real spiritual elevation to truly achieve. It's not easy.
It's not just a nice sentiment. It requires inner work. And engaging with the Zohar itself, studying its ideas, is presented as a direct spiritual practice, a way to participate in this tikkun.
And lastly, that idea of teshuvah, return. How does that tie into waking the sleepers?
Teshuvah, return. In this context, it's about turning away from, overcoming the lies of hierarchy, those structures built on the uncorrected will to receive. The Zohar sees those as distortions, illusions almost.
So waking the sleepers is like a collective teshuvah.
Yes. A conscious collective turning away from those power dynamics based on separation and ego, and a return to the true, receptive, interconnected nature of reality, as symbolized by Malchut in its ideal state. Guided by the wisdom found in texts like the Zohar, it's realizing fulfillment comes from connection, from bestowal, not just from taking.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive, looking through the Zohar's lens, shows that ancient request for a king was way more than politics, a huge spiritual pivot point.
Definitely.
The Zohar gives us this stark contrast between true, divinely connected authority, Malchut, and the serious dangers of human power when it gets cut off from that source.
It highlights how our collective choices, often driven by fear or wanting to fit in, can lead to separation, darkness, and the very hierarchies and oppressions we lament.
But it doesn't leave us there. It offers tikkun, this path of correction, healing, return.
Exactly. It provides a framework, a deep one, for understanding the spiritual roots of our societal struggles. And it insists that real transformation isn't just about tweaking the external structures. It demands an internal shift.
From seeking external control to cultivating inner spiritual sovereignty, aligning with divine principles.
That's the core message.
So for you, the listener, as you reflect on all this, maybe consider how these ideas play out. Malchut, that balance of receiving and channeling, that underlying will to receive. Where do you see them in your own life, in the structures around you?
Yeah, it's a personal reflection, too.
And maybe think, what steps, even small ones, could lead towards personal and collective tikkun, towards reclaiming that inner delight, that connection, moving towards a reality more aligned with these deeper principles. Perhaps exploring the Zohar further could unlock even more insights on that journey.